Dream vision solved the case of a lost girl's justice. Summary: Detective Ryan Blake is thrust into a haunting mystery when ghostly dreams lead him to a decades-old cold case. The specter of a young girl, Sophia Hale, appears in his visions, pleading for him to uncover the truth about her disappearance. Guided by her clues, Ryan delves into the forgotten case, unearthing evidence buried in both the physical world and the minds of those involved. As he pieces together Sophia's tragic story, Ryan confronts Charles Hart, a man whose secrets hold the key to the case. Hart's denial crumbles under the weight of Ryan's investigation, revealing a tale of obsession and a life stolen too soon. Amidst the revelations, Sophia's spirit offers Ryan guidance and, ultimately, gratitude for giving her family the closure they longed for. This journey tests Ryan's resolve, forcing him to grapple with his own fears and the thin line between justice and the supernatural. By the end, Ryan emerges transformed, forever marked by his encounter with Sophia's ghost and the unyielding pursuit of truth. The resolution brings bittersweet relief, leaving Sophia at peace and Ryan with a deeper understanding of both the darkness and light within humanity. Part 1. The Haunting Dream. Detective Ryan Blake's nights had become a torment. Every time he closed his eyes, he was dragged into the same dream, a suffocating fog blanketing a forest that felt alive, its shadows whispering secrets he couldn't understand. In the heart of the mist, she appeared, a young girl, her pale face streaked with tears and dirt. Her tattered dress swayed in an unseen breeze, and her wide, desperate eyes locked onto his. "Find me," she whispered, her voice fragile yet urgent. Ryan always woke in a cold sweat, her plea echoing in his mind. For a week, the dream replayed without fail, each time more vivid, more haunting. He could feel the damp earth under his feet, hear the faint rustle of unseen creatures, and smell the pungent scent of decaying leaves. By the fourth night, her name surfaced in his mind like a revelation: Sophia Hale. He had no idea how he knew it, but it was as clear as the desperation in her voice. Her whisper turned into a haunting mantra: "Find me. He won't stop." The relentless whisper. Ryan's exhaustion seeped into his waking life. The lines between dream and reality blurred, shadows growing longer and darker. His colleagues noticed his disheveled appearance and distant demeanor. Officer Daniels placed a steaming coffee on his desk one morning, his concern evident. "Blake, you're looking rough." "Trouble sleeping?" "Something like that," Ryan mumbled, staring into the dark liquid as if it held answers. The whispers didn't stop with the dreams. At odd moments during the day, he'd hear the faintest echo of Sophia's voice. In the precinct bathroom, over the hum of the vending machine, or just as he was drifting off into a nap during lunch. Always the same plea: "Find me." The sheer persistence wore at him, gnawed at the edges of his sanity. He couldn't tell them. How could he admit he was haunted by a ghost, a child he had never met, begging him to uncover a truth buried for decades? The dreams weren't mere nightmares, they were a call to action. That night, he gave in to the pull and typed her name into the precinct's database. Digging into the past. Sophia Hale. Missing person. Case 4203. The file appeared, its contents sparse but damning. Sophia had vanished 20 years ago while walking home from school. Witnesses last saw her near Blackwood Forest, a sprawling, forbidding expanse on the town's edge. The investigation had turned up nothing, and the case went cold. The photograph in the file made Ryan's breath hitch. It was her, the girl from his dreams, her eyes as haunting in print as they were in his mind. The case gnawed at him. Sophia's parents had been left in limbo, clinging to hope as the years passed without answers. Blackwood Forest had been searched thoroughly, but whatever secrets it held had remained hidden. Now, those secrets were calling to him. That evening, Ryan sat in his dimly lit apartment, the case file spread out before him. Notes scrawled in faded ink, timelines meticulously logged, and yet no tangible leads. The police had tried, but someone had eluded them. Ryan's fingers grazed over the grainy photograph of Sophia, and a chill ran down his spine. Into the forest. Ryan drove to Blackwood Forest at dusk, the orange glow of the setting sun swallowed by the dark canopy of trees. The entrance loomed like the maw of some great beast, daring him to enter. The air was thick with moisture, and the temperature seemed to drop as he stepped onto the path. Each crunch of leaves underfoot echoed unnaturally, the forest's silence oppressive. The deeper he ventured, the more familiar it became. The gnarled trees, the shifting fog, the almost tangible sense of being watched, it was all exactly as he'd dreamed. His flashlight's beam cut through the mist, but it couldn't dispel the feeling of dread tightening around him like a vice. Then he heard it, the soft, heart-wrenching sobbing of a child. "Sophia," he called, his voice wavering. The sobbing stopped. The stillness was deafening. Discovery in the mist. She appeared just ahead, her translucent form shimmering faintly. Her lips quivered as she raised a trembling hand and pointed. "Please," she whispered. "Find me." Ryan's heart pounded as he followed her gesture to a cluster of stones half hidden by moss and dirt. Dropping to his knees, he began to dig with his hands. The earth was cold and unyielding, but he clawed at it relentlessly, the urgency in Sophia's gaze spurring him on. His fingers scraped against something metallic. Pulling it free, he found a small, rusted locket. Its hinges resisted, but he pried it open. Inside was a photograph of Sophia and a man whose face sent a chill through Ryan. It was familiar, not from his dreams, but from the precinct's wall of unsolved cases. Recognition settled like a weight in his chest. Sophia's voice came again, softer now, almost tender. He knows when Ryan looked up, she was gone. The forest seemed to exhale. The fog thinning as silence enveloped him. He clutched the locket tightly, his mind racing. Sophia had led him to this, but it was only the beginning. The case wasn't just a cold file anymore, it was alive, demanding his attention. The unseen forces. Returning to the precinct, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. The shadows seemed to press in closer, the street lights flickering as he drove through the empty streets. He placed the locket on his desk, staring at the photograph of the man. His features were unmistakable. James Kroll, a local handyman whose name had surfaced in unrelated cases of missing persons, but never proven guilty. A wave of nausea swept over Ryan as he connected the dots. Kroll had been near Blackwood Forest 20 years ago. He still lived nearby. And now, the ghost of a child had pointed directly at him. The dream that night was worse than ever. Sophia's cries turned to screams, the forest bleeding shadows that reached for him. A figure loomed in the background, faceless but menacing. When Ryan woke, his throat was raw from screaming, and his sheets were soaked with sweat. He knew he couldn't wait any longer. A ghost's final plea. Ryan returned to Blackwood Forest before dawn, the locket in his pocket, and determination hardening his resolve. The fog was thicker this time, the air colder. He followed Sophia's faint whispers, her form flickering in and out of sight like a candle in the wind. She led him deeper into the woods, to a clearing he hadn't seen before. In the center stood a weathered, crumbling shed. Its door creaked as Ryan pushed it open, revealing a sight that stole his breath: scattered belongings, photographs, and a makeshift grave marked with a child's shoe. Sophia's presence grew stronger, her whispers now a cacophony of pain and rage. "Here," she said, her voice resolute. "He must pay to be continued." Part 2. The Forgotten Case. Detective Ryan Blake sat at his desk, the faint hum of fluorescent lights casting a sterile glow over the precinct. The small locket lay open before him, revealing the haunting photograph of Sophia Hale and the unknown man. His fingers traced the edges of the rusted metal, and his mind raced with questions. Who was this man? Why did Sophia's ghost lead him to the locket? What had truly happened 20 years ago? The cold case file was thicker than he expected. He carefully flipped through its brittle pages, the faded ink detailing a story of despair and dead ends. The investigation had been exhaustive: searches through Blackwood Forest, interviews with dozens of witnesses, and countless hours spent chasing shadows. Yet no solid evidence had ever emerged. Sophia had simply vanished, leaving her family and the community in anguish. Ryan's eyes landed on a name: Eleanor Hale, Sophia's mother. She was still listed at the same address, a crumbling 2-story house on the outskirts of town. Something in the file mentioned her being uncooperative, consumed by grief, and unwilling to speak to law enforcement. But now, with the locket in hand and Sophia's whispers urging him forward, Ryan felt it was time to revisit the Hale family home. The house was as desolate as the case file I'd described. Peeling paint clung stubbornly to the wooden siding, and the yard was overgrown with weeds that clawed at the edges of a sagging picket fence. A single porch light flickered weakly, casting long, unsettling shadows. The sight of the house stirred an inexplicable unease within him, as if the structure itself bore the weight of 2 decades of sorrow. Ryan knocked, the sound echoing in the stillness of the evening. After a long pause, the door creaked open, revealing a frail woman with hollow eyes. Eleanor Hale looked as though the years had weighed heavier on her than they should. Her gaze flicked to the locket in Ryan's hand, and her breath hitched. "Where did you find that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "In the forest," Ryan replied. "Sophia led me to it." Eleanor's expression hardened, a mixture of fear and pain crossing her face. "You shouldn't have gone there," she whispered, stepping aside to let him in. The interior of the house was dim, the air heavy with the scent of dust and decay. The floor creaked beneath Ryan's weight, each step amplifying the house's eerie silence. Photographs lined the walls, most of them faded, but one caught Ryan's attention immediately, a picture of Sophia, smiling brightly, with the same man from the locket standing behind her. He pointed to it. "Who is he?" Eleanor hesitated, her frail hands gripping the arm of a worn chair. "That's Richard Hale," she said, her voice barely audible. "My late husband." Sophia's father? Ryan's stomach turned. The man in the locket was her father. Then why had Sophia's ghost seemed so tormented, so insistent that someone was to blame? The pieces didn't fit. "Mrs. Hale, did Richard have any enemies? Anyone who might have wanted to hurt your family?" Ryan asked gently. Eleanor shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "No, he was a good man. A kind man. He loved Sophia more than anything. He died a year after she disappeared." The grief was too much. Ryan nodded, sensing her sincerity but feeling the nagging pull of something unspoken. "I need to look around," he said. "There might be something here that can help me find out what happened to Sophia." Eleanor hesitated but eventually nodded, retreating to the kitchen as Ryan began his search. The Hale house was a time capsule of the life Sophia had left behind. Her bedroom, untouched for 2 decades, was eerily preserved. The pale pink walls were lined with posters of cartoon characters, and a small bookshelf held dusty storybooks. On the desk sat a diary, its leather cover cracked with age. Ryan hesitated before opening it, feeling as though he were intruding on something sacred. The entries were filled with the musings of a typical 10-year-old girl school crush's favorite songs, dreams of becoming a veterinarian. But then, near the end, the tone shifted. "There's something wrong with Daddy. He's been acting strange. He doesn't smile anymore. I saw Daddy talking to a man in the forest. He told me to go back inside, but I heard him say something about a debt. I don't like the way Mr. Kroll looks at me. He gives me the creeps." Ryan's pulse quickened. The name Mr. Kroll sent a shiver down his spine. It matched the man he'd seen in the precinct's unsolved cases, James Kroll, a handyman with a dark history of connections to missing persons. But why had he been meeting with Richard Hale? Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "Find what you were looking for." Ryan held up the diary. "Mrs. Hale, did you know your husband was meeting with James Kroll?" Her face crumpled. "No, but Richard. He wasn't himself after we fell into financial trouble. He was desperate to keep the house, to give Sophia the life she deserved." I didn't ask questions." Ryan's gut churned as the pieces began to fall into place. Whatever debt Richard had owed, it had put Sophia in harm's way. But Kroll wasn't the only answer. There was still something missing, a detail just out of reach. The locket in his pocket felt colder now, as if Sophia's spirit was urging him forward. "I need to visit Blackwood Forest again," Ryan said. "There's more to this than we realize." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "Bring her home, Detective." "Please." Ryan nodded, the weight of her plea settling heavily on his shoulders. As he stepped out into the cool night air, the forest loomed in his mind like a dark, unyielding puzzle. Answers waited among the trees, and with them, the shadows of truths long buried. Back at the precinct, Ryan pored over the cold case again, cross-referencing names and dates. A pattern began to emerge. James Kroll had been implicated in the disappearances of 3 other children, all within a 50-mile radius of Blackwood Forest. Each case had been dismissed due to lack of evidence, the trails growing cold just as quickly as they began. Sophia wasn't the first. And something told Ryan she wouldn't have been the last. The locket grew heavier in his pocket, the photograph inside an unspoken reminder that time was running out. He didn't know what Kroll had done, but he was determined to find out. To be continued. Ma. Part 3. The photograph. The basement was a cavern of silence, its darkness broken only by the faint beam of Ryan Blake's flashlight. The air was thick, damp, and reeked of mildew. But that wasn't what unsettled him most. It was the feeling as if something unseen was watching from the shadows, holding its breath as he moved deeper into the forgotten room beneath the Hale house. The faint echoes of his footsteps reverberated, growing louder as he navigated the narrow space. Every creak of the floorboards above sent his heart racing, though he knew Eleanor Hale was the only one upstairs. Still, the oppressive air and the faint echo of his own movements made him feel as though he were trespassing in a forbidden place. The walls were lined with shelves, sagging under the weight of forgotten objects. Dust-covered books, glass jars with unidentifiable contents, and faded trinkets seemed to whisper secrets of their own. Cobwebs stretched across the beams like fragile warnings. Ryan's flashlight flickered briefly, causing his pulse to spike before the beam steadied again. His breath formed a faint mist in the cold air. Ryan's eyes were drawn to a small wooden chest tucked into a corner, almost hidden behind a stack of crumbling cardboard boxes. The chest seemed oddly untouched, its surface only faintly dusted compared to the rest of the clutter. It felt wrong somehow, like it didn't belong. Kneeling, Ryan brushed away years of neglect. The chest's hinges groaned in protest as he opened it, revealing a collection of trinkets that seemed frozen in time: a broken wristwatch, faded postcards, and a scattering of photographs. The items smelled faintly of damp paper and rotting wood, the scent stronger as he sifted through them. One photograph, however, stood out immediately. It was Sophia. She smiled brightly, her youthful innocence captured in the grainy black and white image. But beside her was a man Ryan didn't recognize. He was tall, his face angular and stern, with an intensity in his eyes that made Ryan's stomach churn. The man's arm rested protectively over Sophia's shoulder, though something about the gesture felt off. Turning the photograph over, Ryan's heart stopped at the sight of a hastily scrawled message in bold, jagged letters: "He knows." Ryan sat back on his heels, staring at the ominous words. His pulse quickened as a chill settled over him. Who was this man? And what did he know? The photograph felt heavier in his hand, as though it carried the weight of the mystery that had plagued this family for 2 decades. It wasn't just a clue, it was a warning. The basement seemed colder now, as if the discovery had stirred something buried long ago. Ryan's flashlight beam swept across the room again, this time pausing on the dark recesses of the far wall. He half expected to see something staring back, but the shadows remained still. Yet the unease didn't fade, it deepened. Emerging from the basement, Ryan found Eleanor waiting for him at the top of the stairs. Her frail frame leaned against the banister, her expression tense. When her eyes fell on the photograph in Ryan's hand, she stiffened. "Where did you find that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "In a chest downstairs," Ryan said, holding the photograph out to her. "Who is this man?" Eleanor hesitated, her lips trembling as she took the photograph. Her gaze lingered on the image of Sophia, her fingers brushing over her daughter's face as tears welled in her eyes. But when her focus shifted to the man, a shadow crossed her features. She let out a shaky breath, clutching the photograph tightly. "His name was Daniel Klein," she said finally. He was a friend of Richard's. At least that's what Richard told me. He came around a few times in the months before Sophia disappeared. I never liked him. There was something wrong about him. The way he looked at Sophia." Ryan's chest tightened. "Did you ever tell the police about him?" Eleanor shook her head, her tears spilling freely now. "No. Richard insisted he had nothing to do with it. He said Daniel was helping him, helping us with money. I didn't ask questions. I was too scared of what I might hear. Ryan's mind raced. The man in the photograph wasn't James Kroll, but Daniel Klein. Yet the unease Eleanor described mirrored the suspicion surrounding Kroll. Could there be a connection between the two men? And why had this photograph, with its cryptic message, been hidden in the basement for all these years? Back at the precinct, Ryan spread the photograph and case files across his desk lamp casting a harsh light on the evidence. He couldn't shake the feeling that the message on the back was meant for someone, but who? The photograph wasn't just a record of the past, it was a declaration, a warning that had gone unheeded. Hours blurred as he pored over records, connecting threads that seemed tenuous at best. Daniel Klein's name surfaced in financial disputes and minor fraud cases, but nothing overtly criminal. Still, the man's trail went cold shortly after Sophia's disappearance. No forwarding address. No additional sightings. It was as though he had vanished from the world. But then a familiar name leaped out from a separate report: James Kroll. In an archived interview, a witness had mentioned seeing Kroll in the company of another man near Blackwood Forest. The description was vague but bore enough resemblance to Klein to set Ryan's pulse racing. What if Klein and Kroll had been working together? What if they had been connected in ways the original investigation had overlooked? Ryan's gut twisted as he stared at the photograph again. Sophia's smile, so pure and innocent, now felt like a cruel reminder of what had been lost. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ryan found himself back at Blackwood Forest, the photograph tucked safely in his pocket. The air was colder than before, the trees casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist in the fading light. The forest felt alive, as though it had been waiting for him to return. With each step, the weight of the photograph grew heavier. The message on the back echoed in his mind. He knows it wasn't just a statement, it was a challenge. Whoever had written those words had known something vital, something that could unravel the truth about Sophia's fate. And Ryan was determined to find out what. He followed the same path Sophia had led him down before, the faint whisper of her voice guiding him deeper into the woods. The trees closed in around him, their branches clawing at the sky. Then, as he reached a small clearing, his flashlight caught something glinting in the underbrush. It was another photograph, half buried beneath the dirt. His breath caught as he picked it up, brushing away the soil to reveal an image of Sophia's father, Richard Hale, standing beside Daniel Klein and James Kroll. The three men were smiling, their arms slung over each other's shoulders. But it was their eyes that froze Ryan in place. They weren't smiling. They were cold, calculating, and full of something that made his stomach turn. On the back of this photograph, a single word was scrawled in the same jagged handwriting. Ryan's heart thundered in his chest. The forest seemed to close in tighter, the air pressing against his skin. He pocketed the photograph and turned, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as he made his way back to the car. But the feeling of being watched was stronger now, more oppressive. Whatever he was uncovering, it wasn't just a forgotten tragedy. It was a web of lies, betrayal, and danger that had been waiting for him to stumble into it. The locket in his pocket seemed heavier as he reached the car, its icy touch a stark reminder of the ghostly presence guiding him. The forest wasn't just a backdrop to the past, it was part of the story, holding secrets that would unravel only if he dared to push further. To be continued. Part 4. The Man in the Shadows. Ryan Blake sat at his desk, the photograph from the basement of the Hale house resting in front of him like a puzzle piece that refused to fit. The face of the man standing next to Sophia felt like a taunt, a ghost of a lead dangling just out of reach. The words on the back of the photo he knows scratched at the corners of his mind. The question wasn't just who the man was, but what he knew. After hours of poring through old records, his search finally yielded a name: Charles Hart. Hart had been a local businessman, a well-known figure in the community 2 decades earlier. But there was more. Sophia's disappearance coincided with Hart abruptly leaving town, selling his properties, and vanishing from public life. His name had surfaced in the original investigation but had been quickly dismissed due to a lack of concrete evidence. Now, years later, Ryan wondered if that had been a mistake. Charles Hart had recently returned to town. His reappearance wasn't publicized, but Ryan had stumbled across a small property sale under his name. Something about his sudden return after 2 decades of silence felt deliberate, calculated. Hart had been hiding, and now he was back. The property was a sprawling, dilapidated farmhouse on the outskirts of town, flanked by fields overgrown with weeds and bordered by dense woods. The driveway was unkempt, the gravel half swallowed by grass. Ryan parked his car at the edge of the property and stepped out, his eyes scanning the darkened windows of the house. A faint light glimmered from the front room, a pale yellow glow that flickered intermittently, as if cast by an old lamp. Ryan's approach was cautious. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of his boots on the gravel. When he knocked on the door, the sound echoed through the hollow house. It took a long moment before the door creaked open, revealing a man whose face matched the one in the photograph. Charles Hart. Hart's eyes narrowed as he studied Ryan, his expression wary. "Can I help you?" His voice was rough, clipped. Ryan held up his badge. "Detective Ryan Blake. I need to ask you a few questions about Sophia Hale." The name hit like a hammer. Hart's grip on the door tightened, and for a fleeting moment, something flickered in his eyes. Panic. Recognition? He stepped back, opening the door just enough for Ryan to enter. The inside of the house was sparse, its furniture old and mismatched. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and something metallic. Hart gestured to a worn armchair, but Ryan remained standing, his gaze fixed on the man. "Why now?" Hart said finally, his voice quieter. "It's been 20 years. I've got nothing to do with that anymore." That Ryan asked, stepping closer. "A little girl vanished, and you left town right after." "Seems convenient." Hart's jaw tightened. "I told the cops back then I didn't know her. I was leaving for personal reasons." "Funny," Ryan said, pulling the photograph from his pocket. "Because this says otherwise." He handed the photo to Hart, watching his reaction closely. Hart's face paled as he stared at the image. His hand trembled slightly as he turned the photo over, his eyes lingering on the words scrawled across the back. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "From the Hale house," Ryan said. "It was hidden in the basement." "Care to explain what you were doing with Sophia?" Hart's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. His eyes darted to the window, then back to Ryan. "I can't," he said finally. "You don't understand. It's not safe to dig into this." "Not safe?" Ryan's voice sharpened. "For who? You? Or the people you hurt?" Hart's gaze darkened. "For anyone." He thrust the photo back at Ryan. "You think I'm the monster? I was just trying to keep my head above water. Sophia's father." Hart stopped abruptly, as though the words caught in his throat. "You've got the wrong man, detective." "Then give me the right one," Ryan pressed. "Because right now, all I see is a man running from his past." Hart's silence was deafening. Ryan's frustration mounted, but he knew pushing harder wouldn't get him answers. Not yet. He stepped back toward the door, his eyes still locked on Hart. "I'll be back," Ryan said. "And if you remember anything, you'll call me." He left his card on a nearby table and stepped out into the night. Ryan sat in his car, staring at the farmhouse as his thoughts churned. Hart was hiding something. The photograph had shaken him, and his evasive answers only confirmed Ryan's suspicions. Whatever Hart knew about Sophia's disappearance, he was terrified of revealing it. But what could scare a man like that into silence for 20 years? The forest loomed in the distance, its shadow stretching toward the farmhouse like a warning. Ryan's fingers tightened on the steering wheel. The answers were out there, hidden in the woods, buried in the lies that had festered for decades. As the car engine hummed to life, Ryan's thoughts spiraled further. His mind wandered back to the Hale case file. Names and dates swirled together, fragments of evidence that felt disconnected but vital. The photograph sat on the passenger seat, its edges curled slightly from age. The words on the back seemed to glow in the faint light. "He knows." Whoever he was, it was time to find out. Back at the precinct, Ryan spread his notes and the photograph across his desk, his eyes darting between them as he pieced together a timeline. Charles Hart had connections to the Hale family before Sophia's disappearance, that much was clear. But his role in the tragedy remained elusive. The name Richard Hale surfaced repeatedly in Ryan's notes, a haunting echo that refused to fade. Digging deeper, Ryan uncovered financial records linking Hart and Richard. Payments, loans, and a mysterious account transfer all painted a picture of desperation. Richard had been in debt and Hart had been the creditor. But why involve Sophia? The answer came in fragments. Witness statements buried in the original investigation hinted at heated arguments between the two men shortly before Sophia disappeared. A neighbor had reported seeing Hart leave the Hale residence late one night, his face pale and his hands trembling. Yet none of this had been followed up. Why? Ryan's frustration mounted. The more he uncovered, the more the pieces refused to fit. The photograph taunted him, its cryptic message a barrier he couldn't break through. Hart knew something of that, Ryan was certain. But whatever it was, it had kept him silent for 20 years. Night fell once again, and Ryan found himself drawn back to Blackwood Forest. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their twisted branches clawing at the night sky. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, the kind that made every sound feel amplified. Ryan's flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow path ahead. As he ventured deeper, a rustling sound broke the silence. Ryan froze, his hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm. The sound grew louder, closer, until a shadow emerged from the underbrush. It was a figure, a man. And in the faint glow of his flashlight, Ryan recognized him. Charles Hart. Hart's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "I told you to leave this alone," he said, his voice trembling. "You don't know what you're dealing with, then tell me," Ryan demanded. "What happened to Sophia? What are you so afraid of?" Hart's gaze darted around the forest, as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. "It's not just me," he whispered. "It's them. They don't want the truth to come out," Ryan pressed. "Who are you talking about?" Hart opened his mouth to speak, but a sudden noise, a low, guttural growl, cut him off. Ryan turned, his flashlight sweeping the darkness, but the beam revealed nothing. When he turned back, Hart was gone, swallowed by the forest. Ryan's pulse raced as he stood alone in the clearing, the growl echoing in his ears. The forest felt alive, its shadows closing in. Whatever Hart had been running from, it was still out there. And now Ryan was part of the hunt. To be continued. Continued. Part 5. The Diary. The attic was suffocating. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of mold lingered as Ryan climbed the creaking wooden steps. The dim light from his flashlight cut through the shadows, illuminating cobwebs stretched across the beams. Boxes, old furniture, and forgotten relics were scattered in disarray, remnants of a life paused 2 decades ago. Somewhere within this chaos was the truth. Ryan had returned to the Hale house after his unnerving encounter with Charles Hart in the forest. Eleanor Hale, hesitant but desperate for answers, had allowed him to search further, her frail frame shaking as she pointed toward the attic. "Sophia spent hours up there," she'd said, her voice trembling. "She had a diary. I don't know where it might be, but if you find it, maybe it'll help." Pushing aside a stack of boxes labeled Christmas and Richard's tools, Ryan spotted a small wooden chest tucked into the corner. Its brass latch was tarnished, the wood faded and worn. Kneeling, he opened it, revealing a collection of childhood treasures: a stuffed rabbit missing an eye, crumpled school drawings, and a tiny music box. Beneath them was a leather-bound book. Sophia's diary. The cover was cracked and faded, her name scrawled in looping letters on the first page. Ryan hesitated, feeling as though he was intruding on something sacred. But he couldn't stop now. This was her voice, preserved in ink, calling out from the past. The early entries were typical for a child her age: mentions of school projects, friends, and birthday parties. But as Ryan flipped through the pages, the tone began to shift. The handwriting grew messier, the words more hurried. Sophia's cheerful musings gave way to fear and confusion. "Mom and Dad were fighting again. Dad said we'll lose the house if he doesn't get more money. I asked if I could help, but they just told me to go play. Mr. Hart came over today. He brought me a doll, but I don't like the way he looks at me. He smiled when Dad wasn't looking. It made me feel weird." Ryan's stomach churned as he read further. Hart's name appeared more frequently, always accompanied by Sophia's unease. "Dad yelled at Mr. Hart today. He said something about a deal. I tried to listen, but Mom caught me and sent me to my room. Mr. Hart told me not to tell anyone about the doll. He said it's our little secret. I don't like secrets. The final entries were erratic, the writing almost illegible in places. Dad was crying last night. He said he's sorry, but it's too late. What's too late? Mr. Hart said he wants to take me for a ride. I told him no, but he just smiled and said I don't have a choice. Ryan closed the diary, his hands trembling. The pages painted a picture of manipulation and fear, of a child caught in the crossfire of desperation and deceit. Hart's fixation on Sophia wasn't just inappropriate, it was predatory. And Richard Hale's financial struggles had created the perfect storm for tragedy. Ryan brought the diary downstairs, his face pale as he handed it to Eleanor. She clutched it to her chest, tears streaming down her cheeks as she whispered Sophia's name. I didn't know, she sobbed. I didn't see it. How could I not see it? You couldn't have known, Ryan said softly, though his voice was tight with anger. He wanted to rage against the injustice, to demand answers from the man who had caused this pain. But first, he needed more. Back at the precinct, Ryan scanned the diary and added its contents to the growing case file. The timeline was becoming clearer: Hart's financial entanglements with Richard, his increasing presence in the Hale household, and his sinister interest in Sophia. But one question remained: why now? Why had Hart returned after all these years? A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Officer Daniels stepped in, holding a stack of documents. You asked for anything on Charles Hart's recent activities, he said, placing the papers on Ryan's desk. This might help. Ryan flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing. Hart had purchased a cabin near Blackwood Forest, a property that hadn't been listed under his name, but traced back to a shell company he controlled. Receipts for tools, lumber, and large quantities of concrete were among the records. The purchases were recent, within the last 6 months. What the hell is he building? Ryan muttered. Night had fallen by the time Ryan reached the cabin. The structure was small and unassuming, nestled deep within the woods, but the silence around it felt unnatural, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. Ryan approached cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The door was ajar. Inside, the cabin was sparsely furnished, but the air was thick with the scent of earth and chemicals. In the center of the room was a trap door, its edges freshly scratched as though it had been opened and closed repeatedly. Ryan's pulse quickened as he knelt and lifted it, revealing a set of wooden stairs descending into darkness. The basement was a stark contrast to the cabin above. The walls were lined with shelves holding jars of preserved documents, photographs, and artifacts. In the center of the room was a table covered in maps of Blackwood Forest, marked with red XS. But what drew Ryan's attention was a single photograph pinned to the wall: Sophia, her face circled in red ink. Ryan's breath hitched as he scanned the room. This wasn't just a hideout, it was an obsession. Hart had been tracking the case, collecting evidence and plotting something. But why? A noise behind him made Ryan spin around, his flashlight catching a figure at the top of the stairs. Hart stood there, his face shadowed but his voice clear. You shouldn't have come here. Detective Ryan drew his gun, his hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. It's over, Hart. Tell me what you did to Sophia. Hart laughed bitterly. You think I'm the villain? You have no idea what you're dealing with. Richard made a deal, and we all paid the price. What deal? Ryan demanded. Hart's eyes darkened. You'll find out soon enough. Before Ryan could react, Hart bolted into the woods. Ryan chased after him, the forest coming alive with the sounds of snapping branches and heavy breaths. But Hart was fast, disappearing into the shadows as if the forest had swallowed him whole. Ryan stopped, his chest heaving as he scanned the darkness. The forest was silent again, but the weight of Hart's words lingered. Whatever had happened to Sophia wasn't just a crime, it was something far more sinister. Back at the precinct, Ryan stared at the evidence spread across his desk. The diary, the photograph, the maps all pointed to a truth buried deeper than he'd imagined. Hart's fixation on Sophia, Richard's desperate choices, and the forest's haunting presence were pieces of a puzzle that refused to come together. But Ryan wasn't giving up. He owed it to Sophia, to Eleanor, and to the truth. As he prepared to dive back into the case, the photograph on his desk seemed to glare at him. its edges curling like a warning. The words scrawled across the back echoed in his mind. He knows whoever he was. Ryan was getting closer. And the closer he got, the more dangerous the hunt became. To be continued. Part 6. The Confrontation. Ryan Blake drove through the rain-slicked streets, his mind racing. Weeks of relentless investigation had led him to this moment. Shadows of forgotten truths, fragments of old fears, and whispers of guilt swirled together as he pieced it all into one inescapable conclusion. Charles Hart was the key. His denials, evasions, and carefully curated silence had only fueled Ryan's determination to expose the truth. Now, the time for confrontation had come. The cabin in Blackwood Forest loomed ahead, barely visible through the dense fog that clung to the trees like a living thing. Ryan parked his car at the edge of the clearing, cutting the engine to let the oppressive silence envelop him. The forest seemed to breathe, its shadows shifting as if alive. Ryan stepped out, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots swallowed by the damp air. His flashlight's beam carved a narrow path through the darkness, illuminating the cabin. Hart's car was parked haphazardly near the cabin, its windows fogged and streaked with rain. The cabin's door was ajar, swinging gently on its rusted hinges. From within, a dim lantern flickered, casting long, restless shadows against the wooden walls. Ryan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The forest, the cabin, the silence, they all felt like accomplices, complicit in hiding the truth for 2 long decades. Charles Hart Ryan's voice cut through the stillness, sharp and unyielding. It's over. I know what you did for a moment. There was nothing but the soft patter of rain dripping from the trees. Then, the sound of shuffling feet broke the quiet. Hart emerged from the shadows, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes bloodshot and sunken. The man who once wielded power and influence now looked hollow, as though the weight of his secrets had eaten away at his very soul. He raised his trembling hands in mock surrender, his defiant expression barely masking his fear. "You think you know the truth," Hart said, his voice cracking under the strain. "You have no idea." Ryan stepped closer, his flashlight illuminating every line etched into Hart's face. "Then tell me. Because right now, all I see is a man who ran from his crimes for 20 years." Hart's defiance crumbled like dry leaves. He sank into a battered chair by the flickering lantern, his head falling into his hands. For a long moment, the only sound was the rhythmic drip of rainwater leaking through the cabin's roof. "It wasn't supposed to happen," Hart whispered, his voice fragile. "She wasn't supposed to die." Ryan's chest tightened as anger and sorrow churned within him. "What happened to Sophia?" Hart. "Start from the beginning." Hart looked up, his hollow eyes searching Ryan's face for something understanding, perhaps, or mercy. "Richard Hale owed me money. A lot of money. He came to me, desperate, saying he'd do anything to keep his family afloat. He offered collateral." "I didn't think you meant Sophia." Ryan's stomach turned, his jaw tightening as he forced himself to listen. "What do you mean? Collateral?" Hart's voice grew weaker, each word laced with regret. "He said she'd work for me. Just small things, cleaning errands. I didn't ask for it, but he insisted. Said it was the only way he could repay me. I thought it would be harmless." Ryan's fists clenched as he struggled to keep his composure. And then Hart's gaze dropped to the floor, his hands trembling. "She was scared of me. I could see it in her eyes. I tried to make her feel safe, but she ran. One night, she ran into the forest. I followed her, but it was dark. She fell. She hit her head on a rock. There was so much blood." Ryan's breath caught in his throat, the weight of Hart's confession settling over him like a shroud. "You didn't call for help?" Hart shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. "I panicked. I didn't know what to do. I buried her. I thought if no one found her, it would all go away." Ryan's voice was cold, each word measured. "Where is she?" Hart looked up, tears streaming down his face. "I'll take you to her." The rain had stopped, leaving the forest drenched and glistening under the pale light of the moon. Hart led Ryan through the trees, their footsteps muffled by the wet earth. The path was winding and overgrown, as though the forest itself had tried to erase the trail. Hart's breathing was labored, his steps faltering, as they moved deeper into the woods. The forest seemed alive, its gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The air grew colder with each step, the silence broken only by the rustling of leaves. Ryan's flashlight carved a path through the darkness, its beam revealing glimpses of the twisted terrain. They reached a small clearing, the ground marked by an unnatural mound of earth. Hart stopped abruptly, his shoulders slumping as he pointed. There. She's there. Ryan approached the mound, his flashlight illuminating the disturbed soil. The air was heavy, suffocating, as though the forest was holding its breath. He knelt, brushing away the leaves and dirt, until his hands hit something solid. A small wooden box, its edges rotting, was buried beneath the earth. Ryan hesitated before opening it. Inside was a bundle of fabric, carefully wrapped. Ryan's hands shook as he peeled back the layers, revealing the remains of a child's dress. The colors had faded, but the patterns matched the photographs of Sophia. A chill ran through him as he uncovered a lock of hair tied with a ribbon. Hart fell to his knees, sobbing. I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't mean it. Ryan stood, his fists clenched. You could have stopped this. You could have called for help. But instead, you buried her and ran. Hart didn't respond, his cries echoing through the clearing. Ryan pulled out his radio, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. This is Detective Blake. I need a forensics team at Blackwood Forest. I've located the remains of Sophia Hale. Back at the precinct, Ryan stared at the photograph of Sophia on his desk. Her face, once full of life, now felt like a reminder of the darkness he'd uncovered. Hart's confession had brought answers, but it hadn't brought peace. There was still the question of Richard Hale's role in all of this. What kind of father offers his child as collateral? And then there was the lingering presence in the forest. Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone had been watching them in the clearing. The shadows had felt too alive, the silence too heavy. He looked at the words scrawled across the back of the photograph. He knows whoever he was. Ryan knew the case wasn't over, not yet. To be continued. Part 7. The Ghost's Farewell. The precinct was silent, save for the hum of the overhead lights. Ryan Blake sat at his desk, staring at the case file before him. Sophia Hale's tragic story was coming to an end. Her remains had been recovered, the puzzle pieces of her fate assembled into a grim picture. Yet Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that something was left unresolved. That night, as he finally left the precinct, a strange calmness settled over him. The storm that had raged inside him for weeks seemed to ease, replaced by an inexplicable sense of closure. But it wasn't his closure. It was hers. At home, Ryan sat in his darkened living room, nursing a glass of whiskey. The events of the past few weeks played in his mind like a broken record. Charles Hart's confession, the recovery of Sophia's remains, the haunting whispers of the forest. He was exhausted, yet sleep felt impossible. Every flicker of the dim lamp in the corner seemed to cast shadows that danced with remnants of the case. His mind swirled with questions. Had he done enough? Was Sophia truly at peace now? Or was there still some lingering darkness left unaddressed? The room was silent, the only sound the faint ticking of the wall clock. Then, a soft breeze swept through the room, carrying with it the faint scent of lilacs. Ryan frowned, glancing toward the window. It was closed. Detective Blake, the voice was soft, almost melodic. Ryan turned sharply, his heart pounding. Standing in the corner of the room was a figure he recognized instantly. Sophia Hale. She looked as she did in the photographs, young, innocent, with wide eyes that seemed to hold the weight of the world. Her translucent form glimmered faintly, a mix of light and shadows that seemed both comforting and sorrowful. Her presence was unmistakable, but it wasn't frightening. If anything, it was profoundly calming. Ryan's throat tightened. Sophia, she stepped closer, her movements graceful, as though she floated more than walked. Her form faintly translucent, as though made of mist and light. There was no malice in her expression, only a deep, overwhelming sadness. You found me, she said, her voice trembling with gratitude. Thank you. Ryan set his glass down, his hands trembling. I wish I could have done more. I wish I could have stopped it from happening." Sophia shook her head, a faint smile touching her lips. "It wasn't your fault. You brought me home. You gave my family peace." Her words hung in the air, their weight pressing against Ryan's chest. He had spent years solving cases, but none had felt as personal as this. Sophia's presence was a reminder of the lives he sought to protect and the ones he couldn't save. "I couldn't save you," Ryan said, his voice breaking. "I couldn't stop him." Sophia reached out, her hand brushing against his. It was cold, but comforting, like the first chill of autumn. "You did what no one else could. You listened. You cared. That's enough." Tears welled in Ryan's eyes. He had seen horrors in his line of work, but nothing had prepared him for this. "Are you at peace now?" Sophia nodded, her expression serene. "I can rest now. I'm not afraid anymore." The room seemed to grow lighter, the air warmer, as Sophia stepped back. Her form began to fade, her outline dissolving into the shadows. But her smile remained, lingering like a soft glow in the darkness. "Goodbye, Detective Blake," she whispered. "And thank you." With that, she was gone. Ryan remained in the quiet room, staring at the space where Sophia had stood. The faint scent of lilacs lingered in the air, a bittersweet reminder of her visit. He didn't move for a long time, letting the weight of her words settle into his mind. She was at peace now, and that thought brought him a sense of relief he hadn't realized he needed. The next morning, Ryan stood at the edge of Blackwood Forest, the sunlight filtering through the trees in golden beams. The clearing where Sophia had been found was quiet, the earth freshly turned by the forensics team. Yet, there was a sense of peace here, as though the forest itself had exhaled. Ryan knelt, placing a small bouquet of lilacs on the ground. "Rest easy, Sophia," he murmured. "You're home now." As he stood, a gentle breeze swept through the clearing, carrying with it the faint scent of lilacs. Ryan smiled, a rare moment of warmth breaking through the weight he carried. Sophia was gone, but she wasn't forgotten. Her story had ended, but her memory remained a reminder of the lives left behind, the voices waiting to be heard. In the days that followed, Ryan found himself reflecting on the case more often than he expected. He'd solved countless mysteries, but Sophia's had left a mark. Her ghostly presence, her plea for help, and her gratitude, it was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. The town of Blackwood whispered her name, her memory becoming part of its lore. Children spoke of her spirit with reverence, imagining her watching over the forest she once ran through. For Ryan, her voice was quieter now, but it would always echo in the back of his mind, a reminder of why he chose this path. On his desk, tucked under a stack of reports, was the photograph he had carried for weeks, the one where Sophia smiled, innocent and unknowing of what the world would take from her. The words on the back, once a riddle, now felt like a message of triumph. He knows. Whoever he had been, whatever darkness had loomed over Sophia's life, Ryan had exposed it. The forest, the case, the ghost, they were all woven into his soul now. As he looked out of his office window at the rising sun, he knew this wouldn't be the last time the past reached out to him. But for now there was peace. That night, Ryan returned to Blackwood Forest. He stood in the same clearing, the moonlight casting long shadows across the ground. He closed his eyes and let the stillness wash over him. He didn't need Sophia's ghost to appear again to know she was watching. The forest felt alive, not with malice, but with memory. It was as if Sophia's spirit had become one with the woods, her presence etched into its very essence. Ryan whispered into the night, "I'll never forget you, Sophia." A gentle breeze stirred the leaves, carrying the scent of lilacs once more. Ryan smiled, turning to leave. As he walked back to his car, the forest behind him seemed to glow faintly under the moonlight, a place of quiet rest and eternal remembrance. To be continued. Part 8. Justice delivered. The courtroom was tense with silence as Charles Hart sat at the defendant's table, his once commanding demeanor replaced by visible anxiety. The trial had been swift but comprehensive, with Hart's confession playing a central role. Evidence meticulously pieced together by Ryan Blake and his team had painted a damning picture of his involvement in Sophia Hale's tragic death and the subsequent cover-up. The prosecutor's voice cut through the stillness as she delivered her final arguments. This case is not just about Charles Hart's actions. It is about justice for a child whose voice was silenced for 2 decades. It is about ensuring that no other family endures what the Hales have suffered. The evidence is clear. The confession is undeniable. The guilt is absolute. Eleanor Hale sat in the front row, clutching a worn handkerchief as the judge read the verdict. Her face was a mixture of grief and relief, her shoulders trembling as years of unanswered questions were finally resolved. The words "guilty" on all charges echoed through the courtroom, punctuating the end of a 20-year ordeal. A soft gasp escaped her lips, and she bowed her head, letting the tears flow freely. Beside her, a friend placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Ryan watched from the back of the room, his arms crossed as he studied Hart's reaction. There was no outburst, no desperate plea for leniency. Hart simply lowered his head, accepting the weight of his guilt. Justice had been delivered, but it came at a cost that no one in the room could ignore. The aftermath of the trial rippled through Blackwood. The small town, once shrouded in whispers and speculation, now buzzed with conversations about closure and accountability. Local news outlets ran headlines that declared, "Justice for Sophia Hale at last." Sophia's story became a rallying cry for the community. Local schools organized assemblies about safety and trust, emphasizing the importance of speaking out and protecting the vulnerable. The town held a memorial service in her honor, a gathering that drew hundreds of residents who had been touched by her story. The event was held in Blackwood Forest, near the clearing where her remains had been found. A stone marker bearing her name and the words "forever remembered" was placed at the site, surrounded by a garden of lilacs. Eleanor stood by the marker, her fingers brushing the engraved letters. "I can finally lay her to rest," she whispered to Ryan, who stood silently beside her. "Thank you for giving her back to me," Ryan nodded, his gaze fixed on the marker. "She deserved better," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "But at least now she has peace." As the service concluded, a choir of children sang a soft, haunting melody that filled the forest with an ethereal beauty. The lilacs swayed gently in the breeze, their fragrance mingling with the solemnity of the moment. For a brief time it felt as though Sophia herself was there, watching over her family and the town that had come together to honor her memory. Back at the precinct, Ryan closed the Hale case file for the final time. The photograph of Sophia that had been his constant companion during the investigation now rested on his desk, its edges worn from handling. He traced the words on the back with his finger. He knows. The phrase had haunted him, its meaning shifting as the case unfolded. At first it had been a cryptic clue, a thread that pulled him deeper into the mystery. Now it felt like a declaration of triumph. The truth had been uncovered, and the darkness that had loomed over Sophia's life had been dragged into the light. Ryan leaned back in his chair, his thoughts drifting to the line between the natural and the supernatural. Sophia's ghostly presence had guided him, her whispers and visions leading him to answers he might never have found otherwise. He couldn't explain it, but he didn't need to. The results spoke for themselves. Detective Blake came a voice from the doorway. It was Officer Daniels, holding a folder. "This just came in, a missing persons report. Might be worth a look." Ryan took the folder, his eyes scanning the details. Another case, another life in need of answers. He felt the familiar pull of duty, the unrelenting drive to uncover the truth. But before diving in, he set the folder aside, giving himself a moment to breathe. That evening, Ryan returned to Blackwood Forest. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows that danced with the wind. He walked to the clearing where Sophia's marker stood, the air heavy with the scent of lilacs. "I hope you're watching, Sophia," he said softly. "We got him. He won't hurt anyone else." A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, and for a moment Ryan felt a warmth that contrasted with the cool night air. He smiled, imagining her spirit at peace, free from the pain and fear that had defined her final days. As he turned to leave, Ryan glanced back at the marker one last time. The moonlight seemed to illuminate it, the words "forever remembered" shining like a promise. Sophia's story was no longer a mystery. It was a testament to the power of persistence and the importance of justice. In the weeks that followed, Ryan found himself reflecting on the thin line he'd walked during the investigation. The natural world and the supernatural had collided in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. He had always been a man of facts and evidence, but Sophia's ghost had shown him that some truths defied logic. Her presence had been both a guide and a comfort, reminding him that justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about closure, healing, and hope. Blackwood began to move forward, its residents carrying Sophia's memory with them. The forest, once a place of fear and secrecy, became a symbol of resilience. Families visited the clearing, laying flowers at the marker, and sharing stories about the girl who had brought their community together in her absence. For Ryan, the case left an indelible mark. It wasn't just another file in the archives, it was a turning point. Sophia's ghost had reminded him why he'd become a detective: to give a voice to the voiceless, to uncover truths that others had buried, and to ensure that no one was forgotten. As he walked into his office one morning, Ryan noticed the photograph of Sophia still resting on his desk. He picked it up, studying her smiling face. The words he knows felt less like a warning now, and more like a legacy. He placed the photo in a frame, setting it on a shelf where he could see it every day. "Thank you, Sophia," he whispered. For everything, Ryan turned to the new case file waiting on his desk, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. But as he opened it, he felt a quiet strength within him, a sense of purpose that had been reignited. The past had reached out to him, and he had answered. Now, he was ready to move forward, carrying Sophia's memory with him as a beacon of hope. Months later, the town of Blackwood decided to honor Sophia further by dedicating a small park in her name. The park, situated at the edge of Blackwood Forest, became a place where families could gather, children could play, and memories could be cherished. A bronze statue of a young girl holding a bouquet of lilacs was placed at the center, her face modeled after Sophia's from the photograph Ryan had carried. During the dedication ceremony, Ryan was asked to speak. He stood before the crowd, the weight of the past months pressing against him, but also the pride of knowing he had helped bring justice. Sophia Hale was more than a victim, he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. She was a daughter, a friend, a light in this community. While we can never undo the pain of her loss, we can honor her by ensuring that her story is never forgotten. This park, this statue, is a testament to her memory, a reminder that even in the darkest times, justice and hope can prevail. The crowd erupted in applause, and Ryan stepped back, his eyes lingering on the statue. He felt a faint breeze carrying the scent of lilacs, and he smiled. Sophia's spirit would forever be a part of Blackwood, her legacy woven into its fabric. As he stood there, he thought of the other cases that had crossed his desk over the years, cases solved and unsolved, faces remembered and forgotten. But Sophia's story would always stand apart. It wasn't just about justice for a young girl. It was about the power of persistence, the importance of listening to the voices that others ignored, and the unyielding hope that even the darkest mysteries could be brought into the light. Ryan turned to leave, his footsteps crunching softly on the gravel path. The statue's gaze seemed to follow him, serene and eternal, as if Sophia herself was watching over the town she had once called home. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the park in a golden glow, Ryan knew one thing for certain: her story would never be forgotten. To be continued. Part 9. A Changed Man. Ryan Blake sat in his modest living room, the shadows of the past months swirling in his mind like the smoke from his untouched cup of coffee. The case of Sophia Hale had come to a close, but the impact of the events lingered within him, reshaping the man he thought he was. The echoes of her whispered pleas, the forest's haunting silence, and the chilling presence of her ghost had left an indelible mark on his soul. Ryan's thoughts drifted back to the first moment he felt Sophia's presence. It was a cold, lonely night, and her voice had been no more than a whisper, but it had pierced through his skepticism and stirred something deep within him. He had always believed himself to be a man grounded in reality, someone who relied on logic and evidence. But Sophia's case had forced him to confront the unexplainable, to acknowledge that some truths lay beyond the realm of science and reason. The photograph on his desk now rested in a simple frame, its edges no longer worn from constant handling. Sophia's smiling face looked back at him, a reminder of the innocence stolen from her and the justice he had fought to deliver. The words he knows still sent a chill through him, but they had also become a source of strength. They reminded him that justice, though delayed, could prevail. The weeks after the trial were a blur of activity. Blackwood seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief, its residents eager to move forward while keeping Sophia's memory alive. Ryan found himself at the center of community efforts to educate and protect. He was invited to speak at schools, where he shared lessons about resilience, empathy, and the importance of listening to those who couldn't speak for themselves. One afternoon, as he walked through the park dedicated to Sophia, Ryan noticed children playing near the bronze statue erected in her honor. The statue depicted a young girl holding a bouquet of lilacs, her expression serene and hopeful. Parents sat on benches nearby, watching over their children while exchanging quiet words of gratitude for the changes Sophia's story had brought to their town. An elderly man approached Ryan, his weathered face etched with lines of experience. "Detective Blake," he said, extending a hand. "I just wanted to thank you. What you did for Sophia, it's something this town will never forget." Ryan shook his hand, humbled by the man's sincerity. "It wasn't just me," he replied. "Sophia led the way. I just followed the nights, however, were not as easy." In the solitude of his home, Ryan often found himself revisiting the clearing in Blackwood Forest. He could still see the moonlight filtering through the trees, hear the rustling of the lilacs, and feel the weight of Sophia's presence. Her ghost had been more than a guide. She had been a reflection of the lives he had vowed to protect, and the ones he had failed to save. One night, as he sat by the window staring out at the darkened streets, Ryan felt a familiar chill in the air. He turned, half expecting to see Sophia's translucent form standing behind him, but the room was empty. Still, the feeling of her presence lingered, a gentle reminder that she was at peace, and so should he be. Ryan's transformation extended beyond his approach to his work. He began to see the fragility of the human condition with greater clarity. The case had forced him to confront not only the darkness in others but also the doubts and fears within himself. He realized that justice wasn't just about solving cases, it was about restoring balance, providing closure, and healing wounds that time alone couldn't mend. One afternoon, Ryan visited Eleanor Hale. The once broken woman now exuded a quiet strength, her home filled with photographs of Sophia and mementos of her life. They sat together in the sunlit living room, sharing stories about Sophia's childhood. "She was always so curious," Eleanor said, a faint smile on her lips. "She loved exploring, asking questions about everything. I think that's why she loved the forest so much. It was her sanctuary." Ryan nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of what had been taken from her. "She deserves so much more," he said softly. Eleanor placed a hand on his. "Because of you, she's finally at peace." And so my months turned into a year, and Ryan continued his work. But he was no longer the same man who had stepped into Blackwood Forest that fateful night. The experience had left him more attuned to the voices that others ignored, more empathetic to the pain hidden behind closed doors. He became a mentor to younger detectives, sharing the lessons he had learned not from textbooks but from the shadows of the past. During one training session, a rookie detective asked him, "Detective Blake, do you believe in ghosts?" Ryan paused, the question hanging in the air. He thought of Sophia, of her whispers, of the breeze that carried the scent of lilacs. "I believe in unfinished stories," he said finally. "And I believe in the power of those stories to change lives." One evening, as Ryan walked through the now thriving park, he stopped by Sophia's statue. The setting sun bathed it in a warm, golden light, casting long shadows across the grass. He placed a single lilac at the base of the statue and stood in silence, his thoughts a mix of sorrow and gratitude. "Thank you, Sophia," he murmured, "for reminding me why I do this." As he turned to leave, a gentle breeze rustled the leaves, and the faint scent of lilacs filled the air. Ryan smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in years. The haunting encounter had left an indelible mark on his soul, but it had also given him a renewed sense of purpose. Sophia's story was no longer just a tragedy, it was a testament to resilience, justice, and the enduring power of memory. And as Ryan walked away, the statue's gaze seemed to follow him, a silent promise that her legacy would live on.